Hey, welcome back for Weekend Jewelry School. I'm Melissa Muir. Before we really get going on working with the different tools and learning how to use them to manipulate things, one of the big things that we still need to learn about are cutters. So last week I introduced you to pliers. This week we learned how to cut our wire and what we're looking for when we purchase a pair of cutters. So just like you saw with the tools on last week's session of Weekend Jewelry School, I have a number of different cutters, and this isn't even all of them that I have. You can also see that there is a particular style of cutters that I do prefer. Now, when you're very first starting out, a lot of your tool kits, or if you buy like a kit with pliers, a lot of times they'll come with some kind of a cutter, and this would be one that I would expect to see in a lot of those. And while this is a great tool, there are cutters that are much better. In this case, it cut, but the end of my wire is still extremely sharp. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the faces on these and what makes them different. Now, the other thing that I want to touch really briefly on, but I'm going to do an entire video on, are wire gauges and the different thicknesses of wire. And you can see here I have 4 different wires, and they are all different thicknesses, and I'm going to need different cutters based off of what it is that I'm trying to do. One thing that I do want to stress to you is that it is very, very important that you use the right cutters for the job. So some of my wires that are going to be thicker, I would never dream of using some of these really fine tipped cutters, because if I do, the chances of me breaking the tip off of that are greatly increased. In addition, there is another kind of wire out there that you might see at the jewelry stores. It's called memory wire, and it's just a spool of wire, and you only want to use a special memory wire cutter for that. Now, I don't have any of the memory wire here in my studio, so I cannot demonstrate that, but just be aware there is a specific cutter for that. If you were to use any of these cutters on that memory wire, you will damage them. Now let me show you a couple of my different cutters that I like. In this case, you can see they are all the same brand. This is Tronex cutters, and I have really liked these. I like the feel of them in my hand, and I also like the different finishes they offer. Now, anytime you have a cutter and you are cutting any kind of a wire, you have a couple of different things that are going to happen. A flush cut is what everybody dreams of, and a flush cut would be just nice and flat on both sides. However, that does not truly exist. So you can get a flush cut on one end, but the other end is going to have a pinched edge where the cutters come down. And some cutters are going to give you more of a flush finish than others. And I still have yet, even with the most flushest of flushest cutters, to really truly receive a flush edge. So they get close, but just be aware you're really never going to get that truly flush cut. And if you want that on both sides, then you're going to have to use a jeweler's saw or some kind of a cutting system. And that is another video entirely, not today. So I want to show you something really quickly. These two cutters are both Tronex cutters. They're both the same size. They have the same heads. Their number is a little different because their finish is a little different. The one here in my left hand is what we call a razor flush cut. And if I run my finger over this, I do not feel that seam where these two jaws come together at all. It's got a nice polish and a nice finish. So I would expect that when I cut something with this particular cutter, this end that is up against this flat finish, I would expect that to be pretty flush, nice and flat. Whereas you can see on this other one, you'll notice that there's a little line there, and that's actually a little dent or a groove that's in there. And what that means is that it does not meet all the way flush right here at this outer edge. On the inside of both of these, you can see that they kind of come to a V on the inside. And that is what I was talking about when we have that pinched edge of our wire. So So if I were to cut this with these cutters right here, then this side right here, so anything that was cut from this side, I would expect it to have kind of a pinched face to it. And that is because that's what profile we have on that side. Whereas the metal that would come from this side, I would expect it to be fairly flat. And that's again because it fits within that flat edge. But in the case of this cutter right here, where it has this little groove in it, it's not going to be truly flush. There will also be a slight pinched edge here. And these are very easy to take care of. You just take your file and you file that flat. Again, another topic for another day. So how do we pick which cutter to use for what, and how do I know what is good? When you're very first starting, I highly suggest if you buy one of those multi-pack kits that comes with all of your pliers and your cutters, try out that cutter and see what you think. See how it cuts, see if it feels a little gummy as it's cutting, does it leave a really sharp edge on both sides, is there a lot of cleanup, are you able to actually get your pliers or your cutters into those tight edges where maybe you've got a wrapped loop or that's up against something else. There's just a lot of experimenting that has to happen in order for you to determine which cutter you like best. But here's a few guidelines. If I have a really thin wire, in this case I'm working with 22 gauge, and we'll explain gauges and wire thicknesses and sheet thicknesses in another video. So this is a really thin wire, okay? It's not very strong. Also, the things that I use in jewelry, all of these cutters are going to work great for things like gold and silver, copper and brass, but I'm not going to use any ferrous materials like steel. Definitely don't want to use any of those. I'm sticking with softer metals. If you're wanting to do steel, then you need some different cutters. So just keep in mind this pertains to most common jewelry metals that we use in the studio. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my wire in here. Now here's another thing. If I were to just clip down on this little end of the wire shoots off. And you saw that, well, kind of, because it goes pretty fast. So you want to be aware of that. That can shoot off at about 40 miles an hour. And if you've got yourself or other people in the studio around you, imagine that going into your eyeball. So what you want to do is cut safely. And a lot of times what I will do is I'll get my wire in here and I'll either hold the one end with my thumb and middle finger or ring finger and cover with my index finger, or I might cover with the index finger on my other hand, and that way then my wire does not go flying off. So thinner metals are going to be great with thinner or smaller tips on your cutters, whereas I can still take this with a thicker cutter, a big cutter, and still do the same thing. So if you know that you're going to be working with thicker gauges, then maybe we look at something that's a little bigger. Now, let's say that I want to go up to 14 gauge. 14 gauge is a pretty stiff metal. It's, got a lot of substance to it. I definitely do not want to be using any of my finer or daintier cutters on this because there's not enough surface metal on my cutters to be able to support that cut. Maybe if I were to do it down further at the jaw, but certainly not up here at the tip, I will break off the tips of my cutters, and that is an expensive mistake. So what I want to do, if I'm working with something thicker, I want to work with a cutter that is rated for that kind of a thickness. In this case, both of these cutters will cut up to about 12 gauge, which is slightly thicker than the 14 gauge. Most people who are starting out making jewelry, 14 gauge is probably the heaviest that they're going to go for a little while. So again, same type of thing. I would come in here, make sure I'm holding onto this, give a nice, so you notice how I'm holding this in my hand, give a nice squeeze, and there's my little piece. Now and I know it's hard to see here on the video, but the end that was cut off from the inside here has a nice pointed edge, whereas the end back here on the back is nice and flat. It does still have some sharp edges because we did cut it straight down. So if this were to become something like an ear wire, it's going to rub up against my skin, I would want to smooth down those edges with some files. Now what happens if we want to use something really big? This happens to be 6 gauge. And 6 gauge is quite thick. Well, then you need to get into some really big cutters. This is a LINDSTROM cutter that I absolutely adore. And I cannot get this through just with one hand. This for me would be a double-handed thing. Now because this is a double-handed operation for me, my wire here is going to fly out in both directions, and I need to keep that in consideration. Make sure nothing is around me, make sure nobody's around, or perhaps you put it into a box or something like that so that you can catch those flying ends, and then you can proceed to cut that wire. Now another thing that I like to do too is if I have a really thick piece of wire, I will actually do it in increments. So I will rotate it around, give a squeeze, rotate it again, give another squeeze. So that way I'm not just trying to come down through this wire all at once. But in doing so, you'll notice the ends of my wires are also not flat. There will definitely be some addressing to do with the ends of this, maybe with a file or something. For the purpose of the Weekend Jewelry School, I have included links down below in the description of the video to some of my favorite cutters, but then I also indicate which wire gauges those cutters are going to be good for. It definitely is something that you may want to consider having multiples of, because as you work with different materials or different types of pieces, you may find one face of a cutter is better than another face of a cutter. So I hope that helps you guys, and I will see you guys next week as we start working with some of our first projects. Talk to you then. Have a good weekend.